Welcome to another deep dive. We are ready to extract the core knowledge and insights from the fascinating source materials you sent us.
No need to wade through pages and pages of text.
Nope, we're going to jump right in,
That's right, just the good stuff.
so you can be instantly more informed.
Exactly.
And today, we're diving into the world of modern Arnis.
Specifically, the solo combat exercises known as Labanan Solo or the anyos.
And we're going to be doing this deep dive based on the book by Professor Dan Anderson, Grand Master of the MA80 Arnis system.
Right.
I'm excited about this one.
Yeah, this is fascinating stuff. Now, Professor Anderson, he has a long history in modern Arnis, going all the way back to 1980 when he began training with Professor Remy Presas himself.
Wow.
Over the years, he achieved the rank of 6th-degree black belt and senior master under Professor Presas.
That's impressive.
Yeah, pretty amazing. And then he went on in 2002 to found his own system, Modern Arnis 80, or MA80, which was officially recognized in the Philippines in 2006.
Now, what was his goal with MA80? What was he trying to accomplish?
Well, his focus with MA80 was to systemize the fundamental principles that he learned from Professor Presas. Really kind of codify those principles into a system.
Okay, so Labanan Solo, that's Filipino for solo combat.
Right.
And we're talking about those individual practice drills, the anyos, that Professor Remy Presas would teach in his modern Arnis camps.
Yeah, and there were a total of 4 cane anyos and 8 empty hand anyos.
And I think it's interesting that the first 5 empty hand anyos and all 4 cane anyos were actually captured on film in Professor Presas's first instructional series.
Yeah, so that's really valuable historical footage there that we can look back on.
Now, what I found intriguing is that those empty hand anyos, they seem to be a uniquely North American thing.
Right. It wasn't something that was part of the training curriculum in the Philippines or even in Europe. And there's an interesting anecdote, I guess you could say, suggesting that Professor Presas may have actually worked out the sequencing for these forms in his kitchen.
In his kitchen.
In his kitchen.
Wow, so that's pretty informal.
Yeah, and it hints at a very clever strategic decision because, thinking about the martial arts landscape in North America at the time, with the popularity of structured forms like katas and karate, pumzas and taekwondo, having something that had that similar recognizable format but was very clearly modern Arnis, that would have been a really smart way to gain traction and connect with those folks who are already familiar with forms.
Yeah, and it speaks to how martial arts adapt and evolve as they kind of cross these cultural boundaries and they incorporate things that maybe resonate more with the new audience they're trying to reach.
Absolutely.
Now, here's a key point about Professor Presas and how he taught the anyos. He wasn't strict about how they were performed.
Right.
The specific stances, the body alignment. Like, you could learn Anyo 1, and it might look different from someone else who came from a different style, but both could be considered correct.
Yeah. Exactly. He was teaching a diverse group of people coming from different martial arts backgrounds, and so he allowed for that personal interpretation and expression as long as the fundamental structure of the form, the moves themselves, were basically consistent.
Now, Professor Anderson, in his MA80 system, puts a lot of value in these anyos. He really does. He views them as providing this crucial framework for training structure, proper body alignment, balance, and maybe even most importantly, a template for translating the techniques used in cane fighting into empty hand applications.
Yeah, and he actually mentions that in his book, he's demonstrating the forms as he learned them from Professor Presas, recognizing that over time there might be variations due to Professor Presas's own evolution in his teaching. So he's giving you the anyos, at least as he learned them at that time.
And it's not just the movements themselves. The book also dives into the applications for those moves, which is where it becomes really practical. Professor Anderson's point is that there isn't always one single fixed application for each move. Interpretation is key. Understanding the principles is key. To really help visualize this, the book even comes with the DVD that complements the photos.
So you can see the forms in action.
Exactly.
That's a nice touch. It's interesting that Professor Anderson's personal journey with martial arts forms started with skepticism. I think many people who've trained in different styles can kind of relate to this. His initial training was in Kung Soo Do, which has roots in Shotokan karate.
Right.
And he says he was really skeptical of forms at that time, katas in karate, because he felt that the way they were doing the free fighting and sparring just seemed totally disconnected from the movements he was learning in the kata.
And I think he even had some very specific points that he brought up about why he was skeptical. He was a smaller kid. And the idea of using, his forearm in a downward block against an adult shin bone didn't compute for him.
Right.
It didn't seem practical at all.
Mm.
And the idea of always stepping forward when you block, when someone's attacking you and they're moving towards you,
Yeah.
why step forward?
Yeah, it just didn't seem logical to him.
Totally.
And as his training progressed, they focused more on sparring, and he became quite critical of those who were just training kaida and not actually, engaging in fighting. But he did recognize that there was value in the traditional kaida, even if he couldn't fully articulate it. He could see the depth and the skill in the way that masters like Tiro Chinen and Akio Minakami would perform these forms.
Okay, so what changed for him? When did he start to really appreciate forms?
Well, the real shift came when he started training Modern Arnis under Professor Presas. He found that the empty hand anyos just felt much more practical, much more directly applicable to combat situations.
Okay.
And one of the key concepts that Professor Presas emphasized was this idea of translation, being able to seamlessly transition from stick fighting to empty hands, but also, really importantly, being able to see multiple applications for the same movement.
I think that Professor Presas was a master of that, being able to move from weapon to empty hands.
He was. He was a master of both weapon and empty hand fighting.
Yeah.
And this idea that, oh, I can use this movement for this, but I can also use it for this or this, that was a big revelation for Professor Anderson. He even talks about a specific moment when he was teaching classical karate at Portland Community College. He was going through the movements and suddenly, drawing on his modern Arnis experience, he had this aha moment where he grasped the concept of motion application.
Okay, let's break that down for a second. So motion application, what exactly does that mean?
So it's about looking at the technique, whether it's a punch, a block, or whatever, and seeing the underlying body movement that's taking place, rather than just being fixed on the traditional interpretation of that technique.
So it's about looking beyond the label of the technique.
Exactly. He uses a good example of a straight punch. Yeah, it's a strike, but it's also a forward and backward motion of the arm and body. That same motion could be used to pull an opponent off balance or push them in a direction.
So what you're saying is this applies beyond just fighting. If you think about something that you do repetitively at work, is there a way that you can break that down into its core motion and then apply that motion to something else to be more efficient in your work, for instance?
Exactly. And Professor Anderson really believes that this understanding of motion application is what brings the anyos and even traditional katas to life.
It transforms them from just being rote movements into something much more dynamic and useful.
Exactly. And he considers this one of the key gifts that Professor Presas gave him to focus on the underlying movement rather than just the surface-level technique.
Now let's talk about stance and structure, especially as it's emphasized in Professor Anderson's MA80 system. He notes that while Professor Presas was more relaxed about how people did the stances in the anyos, he, Professor Anderson, really stresses precise positions and stances.
Yeah, and he really views a solid stance as being foundational for maintaining your balance and generating power. But also, critically, for being able to orient yourself and recover quickly if you find yourself in an unstable or unusual position, in a self-defense situation. I mean, think about it. When you're standing normally, your weight is generally pretty evenly distributed.
Okay.
But when you move out of that normal stance into some other position, you need a solid stance to provide stability and allow you to move effectively.
So it's not just how you're standing. It's also how you're transitioning between different stances.
Exactly.
And in the anyos, there are different stepping methods that he talks about.
Right. So you have the forward stance where about 70% of your weight is on your front leg. This is like your power stance.
Okay.
Enables you to generate force moving forward.
Gotcha.
Then you've got the back stance where about 70% of your weight's on your rear leg.
This is more defensive.
More defensive, allows for quick retreats. Then there's the middle stance, sometimes called the horse stance or the straddle stance, where the weight is distributed pretty evenly. And then you've got the cat stance where about 90% of the weight is on your back leg, ready to spring forward.
Okay.
And he also talks about open and closed stances, which are more like transitional positions.
Like getting ready to move.
Exactly. And he uses a really interesting analogy to illustrate the importance of a stable structure. The 3 cardboard box rule.
Okay.
So imagine you have 3 cardboard boxes that are the same size, and you stack them perfectly on top of each other. You've got a nice, stable structure.
Okay.
And this represents your body, knees, hips, and torso, all in vertical alignment.
Got it.
But if you nudge even one of those boxes out of line, the whole stack becomes unstable.
Much easier to knock over.
Much easier to knock over.
Mm-hmm.
So applying this to your body, if you disrupt that vertical alignment of your knees, hips, and torso, you really compromise your balance, making yourself vulnerable to things like sweeps and throws.
So the whole point of a sweep or a throw is to get one of those boxes out of alignment, to make you unstable so you can be taken down.
Right. And he even connects us to kicking, emphasizing the importance of maintaining that straight line through your kicking foot, your leg, your hips, your waist, your torso, your head, and warning against bending incorrectly at the waist or the neck during kicks.
It's all about keeping that structure.
Maintaining that structure. And speaking of movement, he also introduces an interesting analogy for stepping within the anyos. Walking on ice.
Walking on ice.
Yeah. He's basically saying instead of shifting your weight heavily with each step, think of it as this more controlled gliding motion where you're carefully maintaining your weight on your base foot, your supporting foot, and very deliberately placing that stepping foot almost like you're testing a slippery surface before committing your weight to it.
Interesting.
Yeah, and he even draws a connection to the stepping methods found in some of the internal martial arts like Bagua and Taiji, emphasizing that this controlled glide helps you to lead with your hips and really maintain that balance during transitions.
And I understand that it even has a specific combat application in what he calls the sliding front kick.
That's right. It's a very low kick, just skimming along the floor with the intention of striking the opponent's shin.
Ouch.
Yeah, it's described as being surprisingly painful and very difficult to see coming because it's so low and so fast.
Now, in terms of the anyos themselves, there are certain, let's call them signature moves that appear throughout them. What are some of those moves that Professor Anderson highlights?
Well, he points out that there's a relatively small set of fundamental techniques that make up a large part of the anyos, despite all the variations and different forms. And he specifically focuses on the straight punch, back fist, inside block, outside block, downward block, rising block, and knife hand block. He also mentions that there are circular variations of the downward block and the knife hand block, noting a possible influence from Goju Ryu or Gung Fu backgrounds.
Okay.
And that he personally prefers the circular downward block when he's defending against kicks.
And this brings us back to that idea of motion application again. Looking beyond just the traditional definition of what a technique is supposed to do.
Absolutely. He emphasizes that a blocking or punching motion isn't limited to just blocking or punching. It could be a release from a grab, it could be a setup for a release, it could be a lock, it could be an entry into a lock, it could be a throw, it could be a setup for a throw, it could be a choke, it could be a setup for a choke, it could be a grip, it could be a block, it could be a strike. The possibilities are really quite vast.
So how might that change your perspective, for example, when you're learning a very familiar move? Could you give us an example?
Sure, let's take the inside block. You traditionally think of this as a defense against a punch coming at your torso. But Professor Anderson shows how that same motion can be used as a release from a wrist grab by rolling your knuckles against their hand. It could be a setup for a palm strike release, a center lock on the opponent's arm, a setup for a side-by-side arm lock, a diving takedown, a setup for a cartwheel throw, a setup for a guillotine choke, or a rear naked choke. You can use it as a direct strike, as a neck pinch, or simply as a covering motion to protect yourself.
It's incredible how one single fundamental movement can have so many different applications.
It is. And he gives similar examples for the other signature moves as well. The outside block could be a strike to the temple, a way to release a grab, an armbar takedown, an entry into a center lock or a wrist lock, a takedown. The downward block could be used for a takedown to strike an opponent who's off balance or as a finishing strike. The rising block could be a way to release a grip, to apply a lock or an arm break, to strike the neck or jaw, or to take down. The knife hand block can be used as a triceps pinch and strike, as a counter for a wrist grab that transitions into a come-along lock, or as a parry that leads immediately into a capture and counterattack.
It really does make you think about the anyos in a different light, not just learning a fixed sequence, but really understanding those underlying movements and how adaptable they can be in different situations.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's dive into the empty hand anyos specifically. What can you tell us about them?
Sure. Professor Anderson points out that anyos 1 through 5 follow that classic H-stepping pattern that's characteristic of the high-end katas in Shotokan karate, likely reflecting Professor Presas' earlier training in that style.
Okay.
And then Anyo 6 through 8, they utilize more linear stepping patterns.
Gotcha.
He also notes that each Anyo starts and ends with that standard courtesy.
Okay.
And he mentions that in his own practice, he prefers to do the trapping hand actions with an open hand rather than a closed fist because it keeps you more mindful of the different applications. That hand could be a grab, it could be a strike, it could be a block, it could be setting up for a lock.
You want to be ready for anything.
Yeah, keep those options open.
Okay, let's get into Anyo 1 specifically. What's the sequence of moves there?
So he provides a template outlining the direction of the step, the stance, and the action for each count. And the sequence involves right and left trapping hands, an X block, a swinging uppercut combined with a pivot, a left side sweeping motion, more trapping hands, downward blocks with integrated circular parries and punches, a rising block, and then returning to a natural ready position.
Okay, and as you mentioned earlier, he doesn't just give you the moves, he gives you some applications.
Right. So he shows, for example, that initial trapping hands that can be used to set up a wrist biceps pin. The X block can transition into a standing center lock, followed by a takedown. A circular parry can become a reverse single lock or lead into a forearm takedown. And the rising block can be applied as either a wrist lock or an elbow lock.
So much to unpack just in that one, Anyo.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And he follows the same format for Anyos 2 through 5, giving you a template, the description, and then some specific applications. What can you tell us about those?
Yeah, so in Anyo 2, we see things like the gunting, which is that scissor-like motion that can be used to collapse the biceps or as an elbow wrench. There are overhead sweeps leading into elbow press takedowns, a cross behind step followed by a back kick, and various blocks and parries that transition into strikes, locks, and throws.
What about Any 3?
Anyo 3 features circular parries immediately followed by punches, side sweeps that can deliver an elbow shock or can capture the neck leading into a spiral takedown. There's a high X block that goes into an elbow strike. A downward block can be applied as an ankle crank, and a rising block that flows into a combination, single lock, and wrist lock, really showing how even those seemingly static blocks can flow into more dynamic and offensive movements.
Okay, Any 4.
Anyo 4 incorporates trapping hands that flow into a round elbow strike. There's a side kick and back fist combination, front kicks that set up trapping hands, a cross-hand grip twist, the umbrella defense, overhead sweeps into elbow presses, and variations of that C-clamp parry, lots of focus on breaking balance and applying joint locks.
And lastly, Any 5.
Any 5 includes circular parries combined with punches and an uppercut. There's even a variation that leads into a head takedown. There's an outside forearm block that can go into a side elbow strike, a heel hook takedown. We see the umbrella defense again. Front kicks into punches, an X block that becomes an elbow clamp and knee smash, circular arm swings that lead into a clamp, a rising elbow, and a knee smash, side sweeping motions, various punches and blocks, culminating in knife hand blocks and combinations of rising blocks and low sweeps.
Lots of emphasis on striking and locking in that one.
Yeah, lots of flowing combinations there.
Okay, so moving on to empty hand Anyo 6 through 8. What's different about these?
So these depart from that H-stepping pattern. They use more linear stepping. So any 6, it features high and low trapping hands, a horizontal parry that flows into a low palm strike, a push, and punches, even a diving throw. There's the umbrella defense again, a front kick followed by a cross-low hammer strike, inside blocks and punches, a scooping hand action with pivot steps that leads into an elbow press takedown, really emphasizes trapping, striking, and throw-arm techniques.
What about Anyo 7?
Any 7 showcases a double block that transitions into a back fist and a side kick, a low and high X block combination, side sweeping motions, a circular parry that flows into a spear hand strike and an elbow strike, high and low guard combinations, side sweeps into punches, a foot hook, a side kick, and a front kick, rising block and uppercut combinations. Lots of focus on blocking, striking, and locking sequences.
Okay, and Anyo 8, the last of the empty hand Anyos.
Right. NEA 8 starts with a front kick that transitions into downward blocks and punches. A combination of a foot sweep and horizontal sweep going into a side kick, downward blocks that flow into inside blocks and punches, a high X block that becomes an elbow press, a horizontal parry that sets up a throat strike, umbrella defense into a knife hand strike or palm strike, circular parry and high sweep combinations leading to side kicks.
Real mix of techniques in that one.
Yeah, striking, blocking, sweeping, some entries into grappling techniques.
Okay, so let's move on to the Keen Anyos.
All right, so these 4 cane anyos, these are really the foundational ones. Professor Anderson describes them as containing the basic cane strikes and defenses as taught by Professor Presas. And these were taught both in the U.S. and the Philippines. And they appear in Professor Presas' first book and video series.
Okay.
And there's an interesting bit of trivia here. Apparently, Roland Dantes recalled Professor Presas telling him that these particular anyos were partly from his grandfather and partly things that he had incorporated from his own research.
Okay, so these forms have a deep history going back in his family.
Yeah, it's cool.
It is.
And Professor Anderson notes that there's a visual difference between the first three, which have a more flowing feel, and Anyo 4, which feels a bit more, well, almost Japanese kata-like in how structured it is. He also mentions that in Professor Presas' early video, strikes number 8 and 9 in Anyos 1 and 2 were more banda-ibanda.
Which
That back and forth motion.
Oh.
And that Anyo 4, he actually demonstrated that with a blade in the video. Interesting little historical footnote there.
So how does Professor Anderson describe these anyos in the book?
So for clarity, he uses a clock face as a reference for the stepping directions.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and he gives a really detailed breakdown of each anyo, listing the strike or block being done by a particular foot, the step that's taken, the resulting stance, and the direction of the step. He also defines terms like upcut, which refers to one half of that figure 8 striking motion.
Okay.
And then he gives a very concise narrative description of each anyo, detailing the strikes, the blocks, the steps, the stances.
Very thorough.
Very thorough.
Okay, so we've covered the empty hand and the single cane anyos. Now he talks about something called auxiliary anyos. What are those all about?
Yeah, so this is where he takes Professor Presas' principles and adapts them to other weapons.
Okay.
Because Professor Presas primarily taught empty hand and single cane anyos.
Okay.
So these auxiliary anyos include double cane, solo blade, the bolo specifically, espada y daga, and baston y daga.
Wow. So he's really taking those core principles and branching out into different weapon systems.
Yeah, he is.
That's pretty cool.
It's really interesting stuff. So he starts with what he calls the MA80 blocking form.
Okay.
And this is a solo exercise he developed to train students to effectively block incoming cane strikes from whatever position they happen to be in.
So they don't have to think about, oh, what's the right block for this attack? They can just react.
Exactly. It gets you out of that mindset of overthinking and helps you to develop that instinctive reaction.
So how does this blocking form work?
So he outlines a 3-step training method: prepare, step, block. And then he details a sequence of 13 blocks against various numbered strikes, introducing some new blocks like the drop shot, both left and right side, the swat, and the tip-up vertical parry, as well as the drop step.
And what are some of the key points he emphasizes in this blocking form?
He really stresses the importance of the check hand, particularly in the drop shot, which is used for close-range defense against knee attacks when your cane happens to be on the same side as the attack.
Oh.
He also explains that the tip-up vertical parry and the swat, they offer alternatives to the vertical block, particularly when your cane isn't in that optimal vertical position to perform that block.
Okay, makes sense. So what about the blade forms?
All right, so the blade forms, specifically the bolo, he calls them blade anyos 1 through 4.
Okay.
And he emphasizes that this is his interpretation of how the cane anyos could be adapted for the bolo. Professor Presas didn't specifically teach weapon applications for the cane anyos.
Okay, so this is Professor Anderson taking those core principles and applying them to a different weapon system.
Yeah, he's expanding on the foundation that was laid by Professor Presas.
Gotcha.
So in Blade Anyo #1, he highlights the use of wrist action to sort of wind up before the strikes. He uses shorter stances. There's a circling check hand motion, a side cut done in horse stance, that closed to open bond by Ibanda motion, but stepping back while doing it. He also incorporates the butcher's block, which is a really powerful block, combined with a check. And the final actions of Blade Anyo #1, they mirror those of Cane Anyo 1.
Okay.
And he mentions that the opening flourish can actually be a palace defense as well,
What is it?
against a downward strike.
Okay, what about Blade on your #2?
So Blade Anyo #2, he talks about the sidestep into cat stance, a parry, then a slanting cut, and then a variation where the check hand parries closer to the face. It's a single movement. And he explains that first move, that can be applied as a sidestep to avoid a downward cut while you're simultaneously countercutting. And he even talks about contingency moves built into that step and twirl action. Like you could go tip of the blade to the eyes, whip to the eyes, cuts to the back.
So lots of options built into that one movement.
Right. Lots of possibilities there.
What about Blade on your #3?
Blade on Yeshek 3, it starts with 2 butcher's blocks, and then there are roof blocks, slash, and slanting cut sequences, with the rest of the Anyo following the footwork of Cane Anyo #3 and using the blade patterns that were established in Blade Anyos 1 and 2.
Okay.
So it's building on what he's already taught.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And then Blade Anyo #4, he talks about substituting banda y banda for strikes 8 and 9 in the beginning, and then abanico flat blade blocks or slashes for those more force-to-force blocks.
Okay, so what about double cane?
Okay, so for double cane, he uses the first 3 single cane anyos as templates.
Okay.
And he really emphasizes that this is for coordination training.
So learning to use both canes together effectively.
Exactly, exactly. So he basically walks you through single cane Anyo #1 and then shows how to adapt that to double cane, with both canes executing the strike simultaneously.
Okay.
He does the same thing for Anyo #2, showing the single cane version and then the double cane adaptation, and then repeats that for Anyo #3 as well.
Okay.
And he emphasizes that the initial move in each of the double cane Anyos is the same as the solo version.
So it maintains that consistency.
Exactly. Keeps that familiar starting point.
Okay, so last but not least, Bastin Idaga. What can you tell us about that?
All right, so for Bastin Idaga, he only converts Anyo #1.
Okay.
And he explains that this is to specifically train that coordination between the longer impact weapon, the stick, and the shorter cutting weapon, the dagger.
Okay.
And then he kind of challenges you to imagine how you might convert the other Anyos as well.
So he's giving you the tools to think about it yourself.
Exactly. He's giving you that foundation and encouraging you to explore and adapt.
Nice. So what does this Bastin Idaga Injo look like?
So he goes through the sequence detailing the stick strikes, the stick blocks, and then the simultaneous checks, the slashes, and the thrusts with the dagger, showing how those two weapons can work together.
Awesome. So I think we've covered quite a bit of ground here. These Anyos are so much more than just sequences of movements. They really offer this window into history, into fundamental principles, and into this wide range of potential applications. We've seen how Professor Presas introduced these forms and how his teaching encouraged individual interpretation, and we've explored how Professor Anderson built upon that foundation in his MA80 system, stressing that structural precision and that transformative concept of motion application.
Yeah, the Anyos really are dynamic templates for understanding core combat principles. You're developing that adaptability, the awareness of your own body mechanics, and you're understanding how even simple movements can be applied in countless ways depending on the situation.
It makes you think. How can we apply that principle of motion application in other areas of our lives, whether it's at work or in our personal lives? Taking a step back from what we routinely do and looking at it in terms of the underlying motions, is there another way to apply those motions? Are we being too fixed in our thinking?
This has just been a glimpse into the world of modern Arnis and Filipino martial arts. There is so much more to explore.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. If you have any sources or topics you'd like us to explore in future episodes, we'd love to hear from you. We'll catch you next time.